Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $50 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. We are rolling right on through March 1998. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. March 30th, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Death of Douglas Dedge. Bischoff on Off the Record. By Observer staff. The death of Douglas Dedge, 31, on March 18th from severe brain injuries suffered in an NHB match in Kiev, Ukraine 2 days earlier has set the stage for another round of controversy and even some shocking political exploitation within the industry. As the week went on, many lost sight of the real story, that a fighter had indeed died. What had taken over was a sleazy political maneuver by a promoter on one side, and the loss of the sport's strongest argument against opposition that have sidetracked in nationwide on the grounds of it being too brutal on the other side. No longer could enthusiasts point to a record of 70 years of competition around the world without a single documented death, and point out that boxing, auto racing, football, and even pro wrestling can't make that claim. And the story that took over was that the former owner, matchmaker and commissioner of the largest NHB organization had used the death as a catalyst to come out against the sport to the furor of many close to the situation and use it to try and promote a new sport. Even if this death was one isolated incident, and that there may have been mitigating circumstances, the political foes of the sport, and there are many, were waiting for something like this to happen, and the reality was that if they waited long enough, something like this would take place. The reality of that explains why someone could die in a tough man contest or a Draka event or even a limited contact taekwondo or point karate tournament in the United States or even a recent death in a foreign ring in a pro wrestling match to virtually no publicity, while at the same time a virtually unknown event in a virtually uncovered sport could result in some major media publicity for several days, including a front-page tease in the Toronto Sun and an AP story getting national publicity, both of which stated that a fighter had died in either Ultimate Fighting, or in Canada, Extreme Fighting, since the EFC had garnered far more mainstream pub for their show in that country on the Quebec Indian Reservation, and even heightening legislative talks about banning the sport. ESPN Sports Center reported it as a UFC event held in Kiev because the sport was banned in the United States. As the week went on, the AP did run a correction stating the event the fighter had died in was not an Ultimate Fighting Championship, but that was long after the expected furor had started. Dedge, who lived in Chipley, Florida with his wife and 5 children, was the head instructor at the Reality Martial Arts Academy in Enterprise, Alabama, which taught karate, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and kickboxing. He saw an ad for an event in the Ukraine called World Super Challenge, which may have been billed locally in Kiev under the trademark term Ultimate Fighting, which read, "If you have a world champion in any style of martial arts, we invite you to take part in our Tournament of Honor, where each champion will defend his title in fight with our team." World champions in martial arts are even more prevalent than they are in pro wrestling or pro boxing, but as best we can tell, Dedge's actual experience in anything remotely similar to NHB was limited to competing, and not winning, in a submissions-only tournament held in Griffin, Georgia. Nevertheless, he, along with Larry Parker, who had recently done a few shows in Japan for Kingdom, and Clarence Thatch, joined a team of 2 other Russians in a series of 5 singles matches against fighters from the Ukraine before 4,000 fans in Kiev in a show called Battle Without Rules. The fighters were guaranteed $2,000 to appear with another $3,000 should they win their match. Dedge left his family with no life insurance. Dedge's opponent was local middleweight champion Yevgeny Zolotorayu, and according to live reports, the match was competitive early. Less than 5 minutes into the match, Zolotorayu gained an advantage and threw 3 bare-knuckled punches down at Dedge, the second 2 of which hit him in the temple. At this point Dedge, who from all accounts had been still defending himself and was totally coherent at this point, tapped out on his own volition. Before the ref could jump in, Zolotorayu, apparently not seeing the tap, threw 1 more punch. It was said to have not appeared to be any more brutal than numerous other match endings that take place in NHB around the world nearly every week. Dedge got up under his own power, but then collapsed in the ring and went into a coma, and died 2 days later of severe brain injuries at the Kiev Institute of Neurosurgery. This death may have been similar in that vein to the woman pro wrestler Mariko Umeda, Plum Mariko, last year, who went into a coma and then died after being hit with a power bomb in a match in Japan. As it turned out, Umeda most likely went into the match with a pre-existing condition. There was no outcry in any state senates in the United States to ban pro wrestling, nor should there have been due to the very unfortunate tragedy. According to friends of Dedge, a few weeks earlier, in training for the fight, he blacked out for no apparent reason. Whether this had absolutely nothing to do with his death, or whether it was a warning sign and the possible lack of extensive pre-fight physicals allowed him into the ring with a pre-existing condition is undetermined. In the aftermath, Fox News Network did a feature on the death, interviewing, among others, Art Davie, who was the person responsible in 1993 for bringing Rorion Gracie and Bob Merowitz together and was originally a part owner and later booker and commissioner for the UFC. Davie, who was fired by Semaphore Entertainment Group at the end of the year and replaced as booker by John Peretti, allegedly because of the belief in the NHB underground that he and Gracie were planning on starting up a rival venture, but bypass cable television and attempt to promote it as a closed-circuit event, similar to the big pro boxing matches of the 70s through the mid-80s, where the whims of the cable industry wouldn't be as crippling as they've been to UFC. As it turned out, Davie instead hooked up with Kazuyoshi Ishii and became co-owner of K1 America, which is planning an August 8th debut show in Las Vegas at either the MGM Grand or the Mirage Hotel, with a tournament and a main event singles fight likely on pay-per-view, to run 3 shows in the United States in 1999 and publish a bi-monthly newsstand magazine. Last week, Davie appeared at a press conference in Japan that announced the debut of K1, a Japanese sport similar to kickboxing that is currently riding the wave of unbelievable popularity. Davie, on the news feature, basically turned his back on UFC, saying it wasn't a sport, and said that he was instead going to be promoting more traditional martial arts. The next day, Davie sent a letter to Merowitz, but more importantly, also to Senator John McCain and perhaps to the major players within the cable and pay-per-view industry. We don't know whether Davie sent them a copy of the letter, but it seemed by Monday everyone of importance in the cable industry had received a copy of the letter, stating as follows. I'm writing to urge you, as the owner of the Ultimate Fighting Championships TM, UFC, to reconsider promoting these tournaments in light of the untimely death of American Douglas Dedge. As you well know, Dedge's participation in an Ultimate Fighting event in the Ukraine caused severe brain injuries and resulted in his death. He is survived, in this tragedy, by his wife and 5 children. As the man who discovered these spectacles, I packaged them and brought them to you to televise in 1993. I wrote the only rule books that exist for the UFC and served as commissioner of the UFA, the UFC sanctioning body, from September 1995 until December 1997. I know, better than anyone, the dangers inherent in this type of combat. When I brought this event to you, I advised you that this was hand-to-hand combat and not a sport. Our original contracts with the fighters warned them that they faced risks and rigors not normally associated with traditional martial arts, boxing or kickboxing events. Page 2, Section 4, Risks of Injury and Medical Clearances. Semaphore Entertainment Group Sports, your company, advertised the earliest tournaments as the bloodiest, most barbaric show in history. You and I knew what we were doing. It was only when politicians and cable TV industry executives began to oppose us that a decision was made by you to resell UFC, hand-to-hand fighting, as a sport. I supported you at that time to protect your franchise. To continue now to promote these spectacles is risky at best. At the very least, you run the risk of being labeled a hypocrite or a fool, and at worst, some young man will eventually die before your very eyes. Are you prepared for that? I am, as we both know, no longer associated with the UFC and have returned to the traditional martial arts. I'm going to promote athletic contests that are acceptable to the states that regulate them. 12 states have outlawed the UFC, and now a young man has died tragically. This is a wake-up call. I strongly urge you, as your friend, to reconsider your decision to promote the UFC. This letter wound up changing the story from the tragedy of a death to the political maneuverings of Davie, who himself is attempting to gain sanctioning in Nevada to begin promoting his first live show and the support of the pay-per-view industry for K1, the same group of people that largely derailed what had been a successful UFC franchise. His motives for writing the letter in the first place, let alone sending a copy of the letter to McCain and perhaps the other bigwigs, can and will been questioned greatly. Some might even call it a brilliant tactical move, although those people would have to have zero business ethics. Davie had been outspoken in the past about McCain and the problems he had caused UFC, and probably knew better than anyone of the ramifications of feeding media, political and cable industry hysteria on the subject. Is sending the letter to McCain can't logically be construed as anything else. Could this have been a way to curry McCain's favor by giving him more ammunition on UFC and thus NHB in general, in order for McCain to not oppose his introduction of K1, which theoretically could, if it gains a foothold of popularity in this country, could become a competitor to pro boxing, a sport its popularity has blown by already in Japan? The belief, whether well-founded or not, is that McCain's opposition to UFC is largely because he has strong ties to the boxing establishment, and the fear that if UFC gains a stronghold in the US, Americans would see who the best real fighters were and realize boxing when it comes to that realm isn't what the public imagines it to be. But the potential damage to UFC is huge, when one of the major decision makers in the process from the start goes public claiming that the promoters talked about it not being a sport and repositioned it only when the heat came, an assertion that isn't altogether untrue either. Whatever ground UFC may have made up through promoting what was arguably its best show in its 5-year history just days before this happened in regard to setting the stage for a turnaround in the cable industry, as ECW was able to do, was lost and then some from the hysteria of the death. It also puts Davey in the position of having to defend the safety and legitimacy of the 5-year history of K1 in Japan, with its spectacular and brutal 70% knockout percentage combined with its occasionally suspicious-looking finishes to a large group of people that would have supported the venture without bringing up any of those questions in the first place. And while there has never been a death in the ring in K1, nor has there been in UFC, the concussion percentage, which is an inherent brain injury, is far greater in the former. However, just as the event in Kiev had similar rules and was very close to the same sport as UFC, so is Draka, which had a death on its second show at the Forum in Los Angeles to no media outcry similar to an extent to K1. There have also been far more frequent deaths in recent years in such sports as high school track and field, college wrestling, pro wrestling, tough man contests, auto racing and pro boxing, although in the case of wrestling the deaths are almost exclusively outside the playing field. Merowitz, who also appeared on the Fox News network, released a statement after the death, but before Davey's letter was received, stating, "Unfortunately, not all events, whether boxing, wrestling or mixed martial arts, are produced with the same regard for the fighter's health and safety as those put on by the Ultimate Fighting Championships. The UFC has demonstrated by its record of no serious injuries in more than 200 bouts, just how safe mixed martial arts can be. This incident is a terrible example of why we have been asking for regulation of this sport by athletic commissions in the US as well as internationally. Its popularity cannot be denied and it can and should be a safe as well as an exciting sport. All of these political maneuverings shouldn't obscure what is the real story. All full-contact combat sports, whether they be martial arts, UFC, kickboxing, boxing or even football, have implicit dangers. Even what could be called semi-contact events, whether they be point karate tournaments or theatrical pro wrestling, will on rare occasion result in a fatality in competition. It is ridiculous, as some have tried to say, to attempt to portray UFC as being safer than sports like soccer and basketball, and just kills credibility when such is argued. It is even more ridiculous for supporters of either boxing or kickboxing to point to UFC as being inherently more dangerous than either. It is just, for reasons stemming from a short-term business approach as shown by its early advertising many years back and some unexpected and often illogical media and political opposition, the group that due to its original rules made it an easy target to be picked on. Hopefully this death from a sports standpoint can be a wake-up call. All full-contact combat sports need qualified medical personnel on hand, and qualified officiating. NHB has not been without some serious problems in the past in the United States, and maybe in some cases it is lucky that such a tragedy didn't take place sooner. In 5 years of watching NHB matches from around the world, I can only recall seeing 3 or 4 incidents, one in the most recent UFC, where a fighter had to be carried off the playing field on a stretcher, which is certainly a statistic many other contact sports couldn't claim. One has to look no farther than the Mars pay-per-view or the early UFCs to see matches that went on far too long, because in the case of the former, the referee didn't do his job, and in the latter, because some necessary safety rules allowing the referee to stop the match had yet to be implemented. Or again with the Mars show, simply allowing Oleg Toktarov in the cage for a main event fight less than 2 weeks after suffering a tremendous beating in a match with Marco Ruiz. NHB is not a sport that can be safely practiced without adequate exams of fighters before going into and coming out of the ring, and without qualified officiating. Unlike the general public, which can shun NHB if it doesn't meet their fantasy of what fighting should look like spawned by martial arts movies, fans of NHB have to understand the realities, and not the movie-driven fantasies, and be far more tolerant when a referee perhaps errs on the side of caution in stopping a match. It is far better in the long run to have 20 Sakuraba Conan finishes than one finish one moment too late. UFC has a 90-day rule in that any fighter who suffers a knockout in competition is not allowed in a UFC event for 90 days, a rule that is similar in most states in boxing. The problem, similar to pro wrestling, is there is no true governing body like in the NFL or NBA. Just because a fighter is knocked out in UFC won't use him, or say he fails a drug test in UFC, doesn't mean he can't fight elsewhere, and other companies promoting NHB don't have any regulations of that type. And even with all those steps in play, inherently, there are going to be serious injuries in any full contact sport, and no rules can change that. A brutal knockout, no matter what sport it is in, on rare occasion will prove fatal, just like a crash on the tracks. The only logical argument has to be if its safety record is worse than what is already tolerable in sports that are given governmental sanction, television exposure, and media approval. But as history has shown, those factual arguments never come into play in real life. Almost exactly 1 year after checking himself into rehab, Scott Hall, 38, again checked himself in this week. He is expected to be out of action until around the April 27 Nitro taping in Norfolk, Virginia. Unlike last year, where Hall was still pushed on television as if he were still around and promoted as being in a pay-per-view main event match that the company knew full well in advance he wasn't going to be able to participate in, this year his name wasn't mentioned once on television on the March 23 Nitro. His house show bookings will all be taken by Kevin Nash. Last year, apparently spurred on by problems stemming from the breakup of his marriage, Hall voluntarily checked himself into rehab. This comes just weeks after the death of Louis Mucciolo Spicoli, who was Hall's almost personal protege, from an apparent combination of an overdose of prescription pills and alcohol. 2 years ago, as it turned out, on the day he gave notice that he was leaving the WWF, Hall was suspended for testing positive for marijuana on a drug test and missed a potential six-figure payoff for a scheduled match at WrestleMania. And to best illustrate the growth in popularity of pro wrestling over the past year, 1 year ago this week, when Nitro and Raw went head-to-head with the Academy Awards, Nitro drew a 3.0 rating and Raw drew a 2.5. This year, Nitro drew a 4.63 rating, 4.90 first hour, 4.65 seconds hour, 4.35 third hour, and 6.60 share, while Raw did a 3.58 rating, 3.50 first hour, 3.65 seconds hour, and 5.04 share, numbers that on the surface would be considered good, but considering the competition being what is generally one of the 2 or 3 highest rated television shows of the year, they are nothing short of phenomenal. The combined head-to-head rating of an 8.08, because the WCW first hour has to be factored out of the equation, represented an amazing 47% increase on total wrestling viewing over the same week with the same caliber competition as last year. Nitro Replay did a 1.1 rating and 4.8 share. This bodes well for WrestleMania, which is still at least the biggest name show of the year, even if last year it wasn't the biggest buy rate of the year. It appears that WWF will attempt to garner one last big mainstream media pop by shooting an angle on March 27 in Boston at a mall, no doubt with Steve Austin, Mike Tyson, and Shawn Michaels. The live gate in Boston will be right at $1 million, the first show in North America to hit the seven-figure barrier since the 1992 WrestleMania at the Hoosier Dome in Indianapolis. This is coming off a week where Nitro set its all-time record rating of a 5.58 since it was going unopposed, and Raw on March 17th, in a Tuesday night time slot also going unopposed, did its second highest rating in its history, with a 4.4 rating and 7.1 share. In the past, when Raw was preempted on USA and the network would give them a time slot later in the week, the audience was always down on the new date. Even in February, when the Monday Raw was preempted by the Westminster Dog Show, the Make Good date on a Saturday did a 3.0 rating, which was considered strong, but still lower than their usual Monday audience. The fact the rating, going unopposed but moved to Tuesday, jumped nearly a full point from its average has to send a message to the USA Network and the WWF. USA Network had already planned, having nothing to do with pro wrestling, to cancel its highly rated Tuesday night fights at the end of August, since the network under Barry Diller is attempting to change its image. Due to that factor, perhaps the one thing that will save the WWF on USA is its recent major upswing in ratings to where it is most weeks the highest rated show on the network. Any thoughts as to whether the March 17th rating will convince USA and or WWF to move to Tuesdays where it could go unopposed and draw a much larger audience are probably premature at this point? And there is no guarantee that a move to Tuesday wouldn't result in WCW chasing them to the new time slot, and the odds are better than 50% that would happen, and thus nothing would actually be gained by the move. And once again, these huge ratings for Raw, both of which were taped shows, once again shows that live versus taped issue has no bearing whatsoever on the ratings. The quarter-hour breakdowns told a major story this week, as the ratings ebbed and flowed back and forth, and ended with WWF actually winning a quarter hour for the first time since the NWO takeover debacle in December. For the final quarter, with WCW having a Roddy Piper vs. Randy Savage match going opposite Austin vs. Rocky Maivia, and they actually wrestled, with the unfulfilled promise of a physical altercation involving Austin with Tyson and or Michaels, saw Raw win the quarter by a 4.2 to 3.9 margin. It was amazing in a sense that Piper vs. Savage hyped throughout the show, featuring two of the 5 biggest names from the 80s, along with Flair, Hogan and Andre. With Piper's first match back in 5 months and Savage being given the mega push, actually drew the smallest audience of anything on Nitro in weeks. Tyson proved to be a big ratings draw once again for WWF, as the DX interview drew a 3.7 rating, a big jump over what preceded and followed it. Ironically in this case, WCW also had a big bump during the same 10 to 10:15 p.m. time slot, as it put Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash vs. the Giant in a handicap match against Tyson, and drew a 4.8. So while the return of Piper and putting him in the main event slot proved to be a failure and putting Hogan head-to-head with Tyson, which was more a coincidence as opposed to actual planning, was a success, the biggest success all was the experiment of putting a Sting vs. Diamond Dallas Page title match on, starting it just before Raw got on the air. When Raw starts, Nitro usually drops close to a full ratings point, but this week the Nitro audience actually grew when Raw was started, and its largest audience was not in the unopposed hour, but for the Sting vs. Page doing a 5.4 rating, while WWF opened with an Austin interview where he gave Sergeant Slaughter the Stunner doing only a 3.2. When the Sting-Page match ended, the normal ratings pattern began as Nitro fell to a 4.5 and then to a 4.3 for squash matches with Lex Luger and Eddie Guerrero, and Conan vs. Prince Iaukea, while Raw grew to a 3.6, Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie vs. Quebecers, and get this, Jeff Jarrett vs. Steve Blackman, and 3.9 for a quarter devoted to Undertaker doing an interview from the grave and Kane doing lame magic tricks. Raw took a plunge to a 3.3 for Midnight Express vs. DOA, while Nitro really didn't gain, doing a 4.4 for the Chris Jericho segment. Both groups picked up with Hogan on Nitro and Tyson on Raw. WCW started a descent with Chris Benoit vs. Booker T, 4.5, Bulldog vs. Kurt Hennig, Bill Goldberg vs. Renegade, 4.2, and Piper vs. Savage, 3.9. WWF also fell from its Tyson level with Farouk vs. Chains, 3.2, and picked up for Bradshaw vs. Wyndham plus Sable getting her dress torn, 3.5, undoubtedly more due to the latter. In what is something of a promotional first, Leigh Thatcher has been able to bring WWF, WCW and ECW together for a benefit show for the family of Brian Pillman on April 29 at the Norwood, Ohio Middle School where Pillman attended. Thatcher, a former pro wrestling star in the 70s better known in recent years as television announcer for the now-defunct Smoky Mountain Wrestling, is now owner of a wrestling school and small independent group called Heartland Wrestling. The WWF agreed to send both Steve Austin and Sonny to do the show as co-MCs. The main event will come from WCW, with 2 wrestlers originally from the Calgary area that Pillman started his career in, Chris Benoit vs. Chris Jericho. ECW is sending the semifinal with Al Snow vs. Chris Condito. The rest of the show will consist of matches from local independents, with Tarek the Great and Sean Casey vs. Chip Fairway and Shark Boy from the Ian Rotten IWA group, Bull Payne vs. Flash Flanagan, also from IWA, Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins, Music City Wrestling Tag Team Champions, versus Brian Taylor and Bounty Hunter, Heartland Wrestling, and Trailer Park Trash vs. Nick Dinsmore, both from Music City. Tickets for the 2,000-seat show can be obtained by calling 513-771-1650. The interview with Eric Bischoff on TSN's Off the Record show with Michael Lonsberg, largely done to counter a 2-part interview with Vince McMahon, aired on March 18th. In a lot of ways, the interviews showed in the 2 men's respective personalities what the general feeling within the industry is on each. McMahon came off at times as a confident promoter, charming, vindictive, a little out of touch, and at times like a politician tangled up in a web of lies. Bischoff was clearly in touch and far more open and honest about himself, his product and the business itself, but while being so came off as less charming, and a little more defensive of his position, although that was more because the host was grilling him more consistently and not praising him at all, while the same host alternated between grilling and heavily praising McMahon, and maybe even arrogant to some in regard to his company's success in comparison with the WWF. A common theme among wrestlers who have worked for both is that Bischoff comes off as someone who doesn't care about them and will say things that hurts their egos, whereas McMahon will do the opposite, even though the belief is that it's maybe more a charming facade. Bischoff at this point in time appears to be less liked by his employees because he's more blunt with them and with most everyone. McMahon is still the one who is least trusted, although not as disliked. And there are wrestlers on both sides have the grass is greener mentality, with those in WWF envious of the money the WCW top stars make and the easier road schedule, and those in WCW envious of the fact that WWF wrestlers seem to have upward mobility and that with the exception of very few guys who are either giants in size or in political connections, that the only way to get a push in WCW is to come from WWF and not be homegrown. If there was a fault that both shared in their interviews, it was the inability to admit even the most obvious mistake. McMahon refused to admit that in hindsight putting Melanie Pillman on the air live one day after Bryan died was a mistake and tried to defend it. Bischoff refused to admit that in hindsight the firing of Steve Austin was a mistake and tried to defend it, although Bischoff did gain credibility points by admitting that when he tried out with the WWF as an announcer in 1990 that at the time he wasn't a very good announcer. Bischoff's main points were to dispute the reputation McMahon has in some circles, and certainly Landsberg believes, as he proclaimed him as being more in touch with his market than any sports promoter of this generation, as being a promotional genius. Bischoff claimed that much of McMahon's success came due to the talent he had working for him, and the packaging of the talent, in most of the cases came either from characters they came into the WWF with, Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage who came into the WWF with their characters and in the case of Hogan was already one of the biggest international superstars in the business from the AWA and New Japan, or characters conceived by the wrestler themselves and not McMahon. Razor Ramon in particular was noted. Bischoff also disputed McMahon's claim that WWF was kicking Ted Turner ass in everything with the exception of television ratings. Bischoff's response was that television ratings between the two companies aren't even close anymore, which is undeniably true. He said that Tuesday at 4 p.m., when the ratings come out, used to be an exciting time at the office and now the results aren't even that big of a deal. He said that WCW has a large edge now in pay-per-view, which is the major revenue stream in the industry, which is also true. And that in arena business, that WWF did outdraw WCW by a 5,800 to 5,400 margin per show. Actual numbers were 5,826 to 5,472 in 1997, that thus far this year WCW was outdrawing WWF, which was the case through mid-February, although at this point with WWF playing larger buildings, the overall numbers are probably very close, even though WCW sells out a far greater percentage of its shows. He also claimed to Landsberg that WCW, which draws slightly lesser ratings than WWF in Canada on TSN, would by the end of the year have that ratings competition turned around. Numbers don't lie, but wrestling promoters do from time to time, said Bischoff, who said that McMahon's interview on the show was filled with BS, lies and distortions of the facts. Among the other statements Bischoff made in the interview were, in regard to Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, neither of whom were stars originally in WCW but became superstars in WWF, Bischoff said that the truth was McMahon wanted Hall to play a G.I. Joe character and the character of Razor Ramon, largely taking WCW's Diamond Stud gimmick and adding a Spanish persona to it, was all Hall's idea. He said that McMahon should be recognized for giving Nash his break but that Nash deserves the credit for what he did once he got the break. In regard to Austin, he noted that when Austin first went to the WWF that they didn't know what to do with him, in his original ringmaster gimmick that went nowhere. From most accounts, Austin's new persona was not a creation of the WWF, but of Jeannie Austin, Steve's wife, although when it started getting hot, WWF does deserve the credit for pushing it to the moon. Bischoff said that Austin would be a mid-card performer if he was still in WCW, and described him as being a big fish in a small pond. Bischoff, in regards to his firing of Austin, said that he was injured a lot and we got the impression we weren't being told the truth when it came to the severity of his injuries, and again said that Austin couldn't be at the top in WCW. Bischoff, when asked about his tryout as an announcer with the WWF, said it was in January 1990, that his total interaction in his lifetime with McMahon consisted of a 2-minute conversation during that incident. He said he harbored no bitterness with McMahon over not getting the job because I wasn't a very good announcer then. He said in hindsight he felt McMahon made the right decision at the time, but as it turned out his being turned down by McMahon was the greatest break of his life. When asked whether it was his ego that was putting him on camera so much, he said that with all the hard work running the company, that he gets to have fun every Monday night. In regard to the creation of the NWO gimmick, he said that he came up with the interpromotional concept 8 months before it was implemented after traveling to Japan and seeing how successful the concept, at the time the New Japan vs. UWFI feud, was. He said that he wanted to take that concept and introduce it to WCW. He said that Lex Luger was originally supposed to be the third member, along with Hall and Nash, but it was changed because it would have been too predictable. He said the choice was then for Sting to be the third member, but he said 4 days before the event Hogan asked to do it. That's basically the story we had heard at the time, although the time frame was different, as we knew it was Hogan about 10 days before the show. In response to Hogan's reputation for not doing jobs, has anyone been paying attention the last year? And his rep within the industry, Bischoff stated that Hogan cares more about the wrestling business than most people in it, and he's one of the least selfish people that I know. He said that he knows what to do with Bret Hart, but isn't sure of the timing of when to do it. But he said when the time comes, that Hogan versus Hart would make a tremendous amount of money and that he has no plans to play up the US versus Canada angle. When Hogan's age was brought up as if he's too old to be on top, Bischoff stated that Hogan still draws more money than anyone else in the business. When asked if Bret Hart was going to turn up on Nitro the day after Montreal with the WWF title, he said, "Absolutely not." Lonsberg then brought up the Alundra Blaze incident with the WWF Women's title belt, and Bischoff said the two circumstances were totally different, being that he knew Hart's fans would have a negative reaction to Hart doing what Blaze did, and more importantly, he wasn't in the midst of a lawsuit with the WWF when the Blaze incident took place. He said that in conversations with Hart that he made it clear Hart should lose the title because he wanted the wrestler Bret Hart, and not the WWF champion. When the host said that all his top stars were over 40 and questioned the company's future due to that, Bischoff brought up names like Rey Mysterio Jr., Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho, and Diamond Dallas Page, who is actually 42, as young stars. When the host tried to dismiss them all as lightweights, Bischoff said that Page is no lightweight and that Benoit and Jericho can wrestle with the big guys, and said that today's audience wants more of an athletic contest and not just big guys slugging each other. He said that Ted Turner's involvement in WCW is highly overstated, but McMahon uses the Turner name to somehow make himself more important, as to be in this promotional feud with Turner rather than Bischoff. He said that he may actually talk to Turner maybe twice a year. Paul Heyman finalized the May 3rd ECW pay-per-view lineup for Marietta, Georgia's Cobb County Civic Center this past week. The matches that have been officially released are Shane Douglas vs. Al Snow for the ECW title, Bam Bam Bigelow vs. New Jack, Sandman and Tommy Dreamer vs. Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley, Lance Storm and Chris Condito vs. Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney for the ECW tag titles, and Mikey Whipwreck vs. Justin Credible. Although not officially announced, the angles over the weekend seem to build toward a Sabu vs. Rob Van Dam singles match, and one last match involving Taz, probably just a short squash to give him a comeback win, will round out the show. Preliminary estimates on the Living Dangerously pay-per-view appear to be in the 0.23 to 0.25 range, or somewhere between 58,000 and 71,000 buys, more likely closer to the former number. It would be the most purchased ECW pay-per-view to date, something that was pretty much expected with the expansion of the total universe to include Time Warner Cable. The buy rate itself appears to be slightly lower than the first ECW pay-per-view show, but ahead of the second and third shows, probably due to a combination of Time Warner's editions being in markets ECW would be stronger than average in, combined with pro wrestling itself being considerably hotter now even compared with late November. Japanese television rundown. March 7th, New Japan. This show aired the NWO vs. New Japan Best of 7 series from February 15th at Budokan Hall. The first 3 matches aired only the endings as Nakanishi beat Tenzan with a torture rack, Nishimura pinned NWO Sting with a Northern Lights suplex, and Hennig pinned Kojima with a Fisherman's suplex. 1. Muto beat Yamazaki in 1450. About half the match aired on television. Muto had a doctor at ringside with him due to his knee injury. Whenever Yamazaki worked on the knee, the doctor teased that he was going to stop the match. The two mainly traded figure fours back and forth, with the doctor teasing a stoppage whenever Muto was caught. Finally, Muto used a dragon screw off the corner and another dragon screw in the ring and got the submission with a figure 4. 2 3/4 stars. 2. Hashimoto pinned Big Titan in 11:26 with a jumping DDT. Titan stinks. It was very physical, but Titan's work was terrible. As always, Hashimoto's comeback was great, but that was the only good part of the match. Titan did do a pescado. 1/2 of 1 star. 3. Koshinaka pinned Chono in 1952. The last half of the match aired on television. Chono was working harder than usual, including doing his first tope in years and even doing a dropkick. Chono was working with a bad back as he was wearing a weightlifting belt in his ring outfit. They traded near falls and submissions at the end. There was a weird spot where Chono used a superplex and Koshinaka didn't sell it at all and got right up and threw his butt bump. Koshinaka got the pin after 2 ultra-high power bombs, although due to Chono's back you could see Koshinaka really taking it easy on him on the impact. 3 1/2 stars. 4. Norton pinned Sasaki in 9:59 of a non-title match. Very physical. Norton mainly just beat Sasaki to death with hard chops. Sasaki's chest was all beat red. Sasaki made a comeback with his reverse Ipponze followed by 3 lariats and a power strangle. Norton came back with both a power slam and a shoulder breaker for near falls. The two then traded near falls before Norton got the pin after a hard powerbomb. Due to the stiffness, this was a lot better than you'd think from these two. 2 3/4 stars. March 14th, New Japan. The show opened with training clips of Antonio Inoki getting ready for his last match with Andy Hug and Naoya Ogawa. They showed Inoki rolling around with Ogawa and Hug doing stand-up with Ogawa, but nothing with Inoki and Hug together. 1. Kashin beat Samurai in 12:49 with a flying armbar. The last 4 minutes aired and it was only average. Kashin has been given wins over all the top juniors on this tour to set him up as the title contender for Liger at the Tokyo Dome. Just before the finish, they screwed up a major spot as Samurai went for a power bomb and Kashin was supposed to turn it into an armbar, but didn't, and Samurai, waiting for a move that didn't come, simply let him down for no reason. Then they went right back to the same spot to let everyone know the first one was a screw-up. Before that, Samurai did some hard kicks to the face and a Frankensteiner off the top to try and give Kashin a push. After the match, he once again attacked Samurai and put him in an armbar, but was pulled off. He then broke free and attacked him again with a chair shot to the arm. Kashin did nothing to break out during the match, but maybe the post-match, since it's something different for Japan, will help. 2 stars. 2. Kanemoto and Otani beat Liger and Wagner in 1829. The last 6 minutes aired on television and it was excellent. Wagner showed a lot more charisma and the same ability he shows in Mexico. He did great, showing he belonged in this company. Otani and Kanemoto may be the best regular tag team in the world right now. One great move after another. After Liger used a pescado on Otani, it left Kanemoto with Wagner. Wagner used a form of a Michinoku driver for a near fall. He then did an amazing submission which combined a chicken wing with a power strangle, but Kanemoto made the ropes. He also used a splash mountain for a near fall before Kanemoto out of nowhere hit a Hurricane Rana and got the pin. 4 stars. 3. Koshinaka and Goto and Ohara beat Nishimura and Nakanishi and Kojima in 13:17. The last 6 minutes aired on television. It was also a great match, largely due to Koshinaka, Kojima, and even Nishimura. The match really picked up when Kojima made the hot tag in. After missing an elbow off the top, the heels used a 3-way power bomb off the middle rope on Kojima. Koshinaka went for his flying hip attack, but Kojima caught him in midair and turned it into a German suplex. Nishimura hot tagged and dropkicked everyone to death until Koshinaka cut him off with a flying hip attack off the top rope. Ohara got a near fall on Nishimura with a choke slam and Koshinaka with a power bomb before Koshinaka got the 3 count with a move that started like a high power bomb, but instead Koshinaka fell backwards with a hot shot-like maneuver. 3 3/4 stars. 4. Muto and Tenzan and NWO Sting beat Sasaki and Hirata and Yamazaki in 13:44. The last 7 minutes aired on television. Muto was really good carrying the match and finally got the win using the figure 4 on Hirata. 2.5 stars. 5. Fujinami and Hashimoto beat Wall Street and Chono in 12:15. The last 7:15 aired. Wall Street wore the same WCW shirt with a slash through WCW that he did in his last appearances with WCW. His work was solid but a little on the dull side, kind of like a Chono with a lot less charisma. It was boring early, with Fujinami worked over most of the way. He got the hot tag to Hashimoto, who made his traditional fiery comeback that picked the crowd up, dropping both guys with DDTs, with Chono kicking out of a pin attempt. Fujinami tagged back in for the finish, giving Hiro Saito, who tried to interfere, a drop kick. Chono used a Yakuza kick on Wall Street when Fujinami moved, but then hit a low kick on Fujinami. However, Fujinami then caught Chono in an abdominal stretch and dropped it into a lateral guillotine for the pin. With Fujinami challenging for the IWGP Heavyweight belt on the Tokyo Dome show, the idea of the match was to put Fujinami back in the spotlight for the finish. He isn't embarrassing, but is nothing even resembling the wrestler he was a decade ago. After the match, the entire NWO and Big Titan attacked Fujinami and Hashimoto until they made their own comeback. 1.5 star. Mexico, Shocker won the NWA Light Heavyweight title from Black Warrior on March 10 at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City. Promo Azteca has taped a few demo shows with higher production values for attempting to sell in the US market with WCW Latino on the ring. WCW has offered Azteca money in exchange for providing the tape to pay for the production costs. WWF has also considered trying something similar, coincidentally enough, called WWF Latino, and doors have been opened, although no deal is cut, to get WWF network television exposure in Mexico on Televisa. March 20th at Arena Mexico was headlined by Emilio Charles Jr. beating El Satanico in a hair versus hair match. Satanico had beaten Charles on March 13th in the same building to set up the match. Also on March 20th, Steel, WWF Sean Morley, returned doing an angle where he attacked Ride Jalisco Jr. and not only unmasked him, but set his mask on fire. This is apparently to build to a mask versus mask match probably in September. That show also had a Champion of Champions tournament with all the various champions in the different weight divisions, including Universo 2000 Black Warrior, Karloff Lagarde Jr., Ultimo Dragon, Felino, Shocker, Atlantis and Mr. Niebla, but we don't know the results of that. In AAA, Antonio Pena is making a play for Black Magic and Mosco de la Merced. Black Demon, who formerly wrestled in the UWA as Mr. Jack, won the Iowa's middleweight title from Mascara Sagrada Jr. Black Demon along with Blue Demon Jr. are headed to Panama to continue their feud. Biggest shows of the week were March 21st in Saltillo with Octagon and Heavy Metal and Pentagon vs. Abismo Negro and Fuerza Guerrera and Cibernetico, Latin Lover and Mascara Sagrada Jr. vs. Killer and Blue Panther and Cobarde Jr. and the Vipers, AAA Psicosis and Maniaco and AAA Hysteria and AAA Mosco vs. Los Payasos, and March 22nd in Monterrey with Octagon and Pentagon vs. Guerrera and Abismo Negro Heavy and Sagrada and Latin vs. Cibernetico and Panther and Killer and Sagrada Jr. and Oscar Sevilla, a 20-year-old newcomer getting a big push, and Las Chivas Rayadas, formerly Grand Apaches 1 and 2, vs. Vipers. They also have an undercard wrestler who uses the name Charles Manson. Only other news from Promo Azteca is its weekly TV taping was March 20th in Nezahualcóyotl with Vampiro and Original Mascara Sagrada and Lizmark vs. Pierre Roth Jr. and Jerry Estrada and Pirata Morgan, Tarzan Boy and Salsero and Zorro and Torero vs. Dandy and El Texano and Pantera del Ring and Ultimo Rebelde and Venom Black and Oro Jr. and Shiryu vs. Super Crazy and Jurassico and El Hijo del Diablo. After being preempted the past 2 weeks for 30-year-old reruns of Gilligan's Island, the show appeared in its regular time slot over the weekend with a show taped in late February largely hyping up a mask versus hair match with Venom Black vs. Super Crazy which already took place on March 6th. Galavision is going to a dual feed so the time slots on the West Coast will change. Lucha Lunes, which is EMLL, airs Monday nights at 7 p.m. both Eastern and Pacific time. The people at Galavision think Monday night is the traditional night for U.S. television wrestling, which is why it is programmed 1 hour before Nitro starts, although Galavision's biggest audience is West Coast and the wrestling would in that time slot oppose Nitro. The Saturday show, AAA, will also air at 7 p.m. in both time zones, but that won't start for until April because AAA will air at midnight Eastern and 9 p.m. Pacific this week due to a live soccer game. All Japan. The deal with WWF for Vader appearing at the Tokyo Dome was finalized this past week. What basically happened between the two press conferences last week is that Giant Baba received approximately 250 faxes and emails to the company office from people who had already purchased tickets, most of whom had purchased the 30,000 yen or $250 ringside tickets, complaining about the card. That, combined with tickets not moving after the original announcement, sent a message to Baba and he called for a literally last-second meeting with Victor Quiñones, the WWF's international rep. There were talks about a long-term relationship, and this may be more than just a one-shot deal for Vader, although the snag is that Baba is holding to his old views of the economic worth of wrestlers even though the environment has totally changed. In other words, Baba thinks a headliner is worth maybe $10,000 per week, but when you are booking buildings like the Tokyo Dome where you need something out of the ordinary to sell tickets, and the potential revenue is so high, those economics are way outdated. Baba still won't put any serious money on the table for big foreign names. A decade ago or longer, when Baba offered that kind of money, virtually every wrestler in the business would jump at the price because it was more than they could earn elsewhere, and drawing 10,000 fans to a show in Japan was considered huge. But now American headliners can earn that much and quite a bit more, and economics of doing a Tokyo Dome show are completely different. The Champion Carnival Tour, the second biggest tour of the year, opened on March 21st and March 22nd with sellouts at Korakuen Hall. In tournament matches, on March 21st, Akira Taue pinned Giant Kimala 2 in 9:41 with a choke slam, Toshiaki Kawada pinning Jun Izumida with a jumping high kick in 3:59, Stan Hansen pinned Gary Albright in 10:54 with a lariat, and Kenta Kobashi went to a 30-minute draw with Johnny Ace. March 22 saw Kobashi pin Wolf Hockfield in 9:09 with a lariat. Kawada beat Takao Mori in 11:52 via submission to the stretch plum. Jun Akiyama pinned Hansen for the first time in his career in 15:01 after a urinage suplex, and Taue pinned Mitsuharu Misawa in 15:39 with a jumping high kick. March 22, Takeshi Morishima, 19, made his pro debut losing to Kentaro Shiga. Morishima was a judo champion in high school. He's about 6'3" and said to be built similar to Taue, and since height has always been a big deal with this group, since traditionally promoters who wrestle build territories around wrestlers with similar qualities as themselves, they are high on his potential. March 1 TV did a 3.9 rating. New Japan. The big show of the week was March 22 in Nagoya before 9,500 fans, which was the first round of the tournament to choose Antonio Inoki's final opponent on April 4. In the first round matches, Igor Minert, a 6'8", 285-pound former freestyle wrestling champion from Russia, beat Kazuyuki Fujita in 6:33. Brian Johnston, the former UFC fighter from San Jose, California, beat Yoshiaki Fujiwara in 7:49. Don Frye beat Kazuo Yamazaki in 5:11, and Naoya Ogawa beat former UFC fighter David Beneteau in 5:15 with an armbar submission. Since the matches involved people all for the most part very green when it comes to pro wrestling, they were so-so. Fujita, probably in a storyline sense to get Minert over as a huge monster, took a beating and did a stretcher job, and reportedly suffered broken ribs. Fujiwara reportedly blew out his knee, so that was his storyline reason for putting Johnston over when the ref had to stop the match. Frye knocked out Yamazaki after hitting him with a foreign object, and when Yamazaki complained to the ref, Frye gave the object to manager Brad Reingens, so when the ref checked he didn't find anything. Beneteau was said to have not looked good at all in the match with Ogawa. Inoki was in the ring at the show doing a 4-minute sparring session with K1 fighter Nobuaki Tsunoda. The main event on the show saw Tatsumi Fujinami and Kensuke Sasaki, who will oppose each other in the Tokyo Dome IWGP title match, team up to beat Big Titan and Masahiro Chono when Sasaki made Titan submit to the power strangle after Chono accidentally hit him with a Yakuza kick. Keiji Muto, who missed a few dates with a knee injury, returned on the show teaming with Michael Wallstreet to lose to Shinya Hashimoto and Satoshi Kojima when Hashimoto pinned Muto using a DDT. Muto worked that show and continued the rest of the tour, and was said to have been moving around very well. Kendo Kashin, to build up for his IWGP Junior title match at the Dome show, continued his winning ways, beating both Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhito Takaiwa via submission in singles matches. There is some talk of putting Fujinami over for the title, trying to do a promotional job similar to 1996 when Riki Choshu got himself over so strong with his last chance at the G1 Climax tournament. Either way, it appears the belt will go back to Hashimoto, who pretty much everyone agrees that over the long haul is the best world champion in the group, by the end of the year. In order to get Antonio Inoki's shooter promotion over as being an independent group, besides having him affiliated with K1, they are doing a storyline where he is negotiating for television on a rival network, since the fake promotion versus promotion feud has been done to death in Japan and nobody buys it anymore. And that Inoki has moved to Los Angeles to open up an office and make better contact with the famous martial arts fighter who live in that area. Undercard rookie Shinya Makabe suffered a broken leg on March 17 in Atake in a match against Black Cat. February 28 TV show did a 1.9 rating. Other Japan notes. FMW signed a 3-year deal with Japan's DirecTV to produce one pay-per-view show per month, starting with the April 30th show at Yokohama Bunka Gym, which will be headlined by Mr. Genosuke defending the World Brass Knucks and Independent Heavyweight title against Hayabusa. Hayabusa got the title shot, winning a tournament, beating the Gladiator in the finals on March 17 before a sellout 2,150 at Korakuen Hall. It appears right now that there won't be any ECW involvement in that show because of its proximity to ECW's pay-per-view on May 3rd, and why risk an injury or even at least a wrestler jet-lagged out to perform at less than his best capabilities. As mentioned before, pay-per-view is only available right now in about 500,000 homes as compared to about 30 million in the United States, so there is no real revenue potential at this point. Unlike in the US, the satellite companies buy shows as a loss leader to put on pay-per-view as a way to entice people to buy dishes. Just this past week got to see the match where Genosuke won the title from Masato Tanaka in January, and it was one of the best matches thus far this year. Shinobu Kondori became only the second wrestler from a rival promotion to ever win AJW's WWA title belt from Yumiko Hata in the title unification match with LLPW on the LLPW March 21 show at Korakuen Hall. It was the first legitimate sellout of 2005 fans, with a lot of fans turned away for an LLPW Korakuen Hall show in years, and aired later that night on the Fuji network. Kondori won with a Sankaku Hime, which is similar to a triangle choke, in 12:02. Hata juiced heavily in the match, which was under submission or knockout, no pinfall, finish rules. The only other time the WWA title, generally considered the #1 belt in the world when it comes to women's wrestling, has been held by a wrestler from a rival promotion, was Dynamite Kansai of JWP, holding the title in 1995. Takako Inoue of AJW will probably be the first wrestler to challenge Kondori for the unified title. They also did a big angle with their own group in front of the bigger-than-ever exposure, as they had Eagle Sawai turn babyface and left G-Max and team with Rumi Kazama against former tag partners Linus Asuka and Shark Tsuchiya. However, Sawai then turned on Kazama and went back to Asuka and Tsuchiya after the match. Pancrase ran March 18 at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 2,300, with Guy Mesger beating Ryushi Yanagisawa via a unanimous decision after 15 minutes with no points taken to earn the title shot at Masakatsu Funaki on April 26 at Yokohama Bunka Gym, which will be a pay-per-view show. In a sense, the show wasn't a success because of the 6 matches. 5 of them went the time limit, including the main event where Funaki beat Semishield via a 1-0 score. Daisuke Ishii, the former college rugby all-star, made his pro debut going to a draw with Jason McCulley of Los Angeles. Bob Gilstrap, a Maurice Smith protege, will face Grom Zaza, the former Olympic wrestler who recently beat Ricardo Moraes, in a NHB shoot match on the March 28 Rings show at Tokyo-Bay NK Hall. Gilstrap recently fought in a Vale Tudo event in Brazil and is being considered as a participant in an upcoming UFC middleweight tournament. The final show of the Kingdom promotion on March 20 at Yokohama Bunka Gym was a major flop, as 4 of the 5 foreigners, Chad Casey, Billy Scott, Nicholas Starks and Vaughn Labby, weren't there. It was announced at midnight the day before the show that all 4 weren't going to be there due to weather problems fouling up their flight to Japan. The belief is that with the advance so poor, the promotion simply decided to cancel to save money. Mark Hall did appear and lost to Yoji Anjo in the main event of a show that only had 3 matches before a crowd of a few hundred. Former War wrestler Koki Kitahara was called at the last minute just so they would have 8 wrestlers and be able to put on 4 matches on the show. And it wound up only being 3 matches because one of the rookies who was to debut, named Taro Kahata, was injured 2 hours before the show started and couldn't wrestle. Expect Anjo to start working indies in Japan. The Neo Ladies promotion will have JD's heavyweight title, the TWF belt held by Lioness Asuka, defended on its April 26 Korakuen Hall show against top star Kyoko Inoue. 3 wrestlers from the promotion, Yoshiko Tamura, Tanny Mouse and Yuka Shina, will be part of a major boxing show in Nepal on April 27, which will be attended by the king of that country. It would be the first ever pro wrestling match ever held in that country. Jocelyn, who won the Queen of Queens tournament in Mexico City on March 15, along with Muñeca Oriental and La Exotica Rossi Moreno under a mask, will work for Neo Ladies in May. And veteran Vicky Carranza will come in June holding some sort of a world women's title that she'll drop to Kyoko Inoue most likely. Remember the WCW women's cruiserweight title? I didn't think so. Well, anyway, it has made a home in the Gia promotion, and Sugar Sato defends the title on April 3 in Yamaguchi against Sonoko Kato. Fumiko Hamada, the 4th daughter of Grand Hamada, who just graduated junior high school this past week, started on the road as a ring attendant and trainee with the Urgent promotion on March 21. A depleted Michinoku Pro promotion, with Great Sasuke out of action after knee surgery plus DX headed to WWF and gone, is drawing poorly on its current tour. AJW is running nightly using the masked Zips, Kaoru Ito and Tomoko Watanabe, as the top heels going over every night. The funny thing is that Ito uses her trademark double foot stomp and Watanabe uses her screwdriver as finishing moves, so everyone knows who they are. They aren't drawing at all with that gimmick either. Here and there. Randy Hale's Memphis Power Pro Wrestling debuted a little earlier than first anticipated, with its first show on March 19 in Lula, Mississippi at the Lady Luck Casino before 400 fans. It was basically the same crew that had been working the shows every week in that building, like Jerry Lawler, Sid Vicious, Bill Dundee, Tracy Smothers, Reggie B. Fine, Johnny Rotten, and Tony Falk. Excel Sports, Mark Selker's group, filed a 200-page conspiracy to defraud lawsuit against numerous defendants, among them being Lawler, Larry Bertman and television syndicator Bill Barron's 2 weeks back. Vince McMahon was among numerous others named as a co-conspirator in the lawsuit but not as a defendant, with the claim that McMahon lied to XL Sports as to the potential value in regard to advertising revenue that the USWA syndicated network could bring in. That lawsuit being outstanding probably explains why the Memphis Power Pro promotion on paper is completely owned by Hales, who had no part in the USWA legal mess. Unified Shoot Wrestling Federation returns after a several-month absence on March 28 in Amarillo, Texas, has Evan Tanner defending his USWF heavyweight title against Rusty Toddy and Michael Buell defending his lightweight title against David Elizalde as the double main event on a 17-match show. USWF in Amarillo remains the best-drawing indie promotion in any city in the country, with crowds ranging from 3,500 to 4,500 per show. Jersey All Pro Wrestling held a convention and a wrestling show on March 22 in Newark, New Jersey at the Sheraton, with Steve Austin as the big draw. The convention drew more than 2,100 fans to see, among others, Austin, most of the top stars of ECW, Yokozuna, Lou Albano and many others. The wrestling show that evening drew 864. Austin had a line that wouldn't end to sign autographed photos for $20 apiece. The wrestling show included ECW wrestlers Axl Rotten, New Jack, Spike Dudley, the other Dudley brothers, Rob Van Dam, and Tommy Dreamer. Most reports were the best match on the show was a four-way opener with Supernova, Devon Storm, Ace Darling and Reckless Youth, with the latter being the most impressive. All Pro Wrestling held its first annual awards banquet on March 21 in Hayward, California. Michael Modest was named both MVP and Wrestler of the Year. Robert Thompson was named Most Popular and Manny Fernandez, who wasn't there, named Most Hated. Aaron O'Grady vs. Vic Grimes was named as Match of the Year. This was the match in July where O'Grady ran over Grimes with a car door in the parking lot. Rick Thompson was named the first member of the APW Hall of Fame. Thompson, who wrestled mainly in the 70s in Arizona, was the first instructor at the APW school. Northeastern Wrestling on March 21 in Thomaston, Connecticut drew a sellout of 1,600 fans for a show that included Sid Vicious, Jake Roberts, and King Kong Bundy. They run another show on April 25 in Washington, Connecticut with Vicious, Bundy, Supernova, and Ahmed Johnson. Steel City Wrestling on April 5 in Irwin, Pennsylvania has Reckless Youth and Tom Brandy, and April 19 in Latrobe, Pennsylvania and St. Vincent's College has Brandy and Youth. Terry Gordy appears for NWA Southwest Championship Wrestling in Dallas at the Palenque on April 10, and Dan Severn appears on May 8. New Breed Wrestling on April 11 at a UA Hall in Schenectady, New York has Devon Storm, Ace Darling, Reckless Youth, Bunk the Clown, Tom Brandy, Brooklyn Brawler, and Harvey Whippleman. For tickets you can call 518-782-7440, and if you bring an observer to the show you'll get a discount on tickets. Former wrestler and trainer Larry Larry Sharp, was named as PA announcer for Bridgeport, New Jersey Speedway for the 1998 season, which starts on April 4. Sharp has been a regular attendee at the track going back to 1972, and his father was an auto racing enthusiast going back longer than that. Independent Wrestling World on May 9 in Hanover, Germany has local wrestlers such as Ulf Herman, Tony St. Clair, Franz Schumann, Cannonball Grizzly, and Michael Kovac, plus is bringing in American indie wrestlers Billy Joe Eaton and Ian Rotten. Rey Mysterio, Senior SS Tekken Promotion ran another show on March 14 in Salem, Oregon with Damien 666 and Septiembre Negro Jr. and Phobia beating Mysterio and El Hijo del Santo and Arandu before about 600 fans. Next show is April 11 with Medico Asesino Jr. vs. Super Muñeco in a mask vs. mask match. Billy Jack Haynes was charged with fourth-degree assault, thus ending yet another attempted wrestling comeback, due to another pro wrestling version of a Latrell Sprewell-like incident on February 21 in the studio of a Portland radio station where he allegedly put his hands around the throat of promoter Jeff Kafori. While this sounds like an angle, the fact he was charged with a crime and the fact that it was a leading topic of conversation among wrestlers at the Super Brawl pay-per-view the next night in San Francisco indicates otherwise. According to Ring Around the Northwest, Kafori had sold a show to a local sports bar on March 10 and tickets were going slow. The owners of the bar were becoming concerned and wanted to use Haynes, who has a big name locally as he was the top star in the Portland promotion in the mid-80s, in the main event. Kafori said he didn't want Haynes in the main event because of his rep for no showing. Haynes was on the radio and found out about the comment. At that point he started running down the promotion and all its wrestlers. Kafori came to the station to try and calm him down and was allegedly attacked in a chokehold. Someone at the studio called the police, and Haynes went after that person who escaped. So Haynes is again out of the wrestling picture in that area. The March 16 New York Observer ran a front-page story on Phil Mushnick. The story never brought up pro wrestling. It brought up the contradiction of Mushnick working for the New York Post and TV Guide, both owned by Rupert Murdoch, who owns the Fox network. The story praised Mushnick for not being afraid to hammer Fox network sports, or the advertisers in the Post if need be. Sammy Ians of 1950 Figsborough Road, Martinsville, Virginia 24112 has just published a 214-page pro wrestling almanac for $17 within the continental U.S. and $22 overseas. The book is a fantastic piece of reference work, with a listing of all the wrestlers in the major promotions along with real names, some stats, although some of the heights and weights are taken out of the PWI stats which in many cases are far off base, an extensive alias list, about 100 pages of title histories and 70 pages of listings with results and attendances of major supercards dating back to the Gotch Hockenschmidt era. This book is pretty much a must as a reference material for anyone who ever writes about pro wrestling. Southern Extreme Wrestling is running a Brian Pillman Memorial Show on April 1st in Cookeville, Tennessee at the National Guard Armory with Barry Windham, Pit Bulls, and Ricky Morton. King Mabel was stripped of Music City's North American title on March 21st and is done with the promotion after no showing the card that night in Nashville. They'll have a Rumble Royal on April 4th in Nashville to create a new champion on a card billed as the Tojo Yamamoto Memorial. They also did an angle regarding their Southern Tag Team Champions as Stephen Dunn attacked promoter Burt Prentice was stripped of the title and will decide the new champs in a four-way dance on April 4th. Greg Price's All-Star Wrestling on April 11th in Williamston, North Carolina at the high school has Rock and Roll Express, and May 2nd in Salisbury, North Carolina at Irwin Middle School has Rob Van Dam and Rock and Roll Express. Arts and Entertainment Network special called The Unreal Story of Pro Wrestling will air from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 to 11 p.m. Pacific Time, on April 26th. We're going head-to-head with a WWF pay-per-view show. Among those who were interviewed on the show are Steve Austin, Fred Blassie, Eric Bischoff, Dwayne Bruce, Buddy Lee Parker, Fabulous Moolah, Ric Flair, Dan Gable, Vern Gagne, Scott Hall, Brian Hildebrand, Hulk Hogan, Jeff Jarrett, Gene Kiniski, Killer Kowalski, Jerry Lawler, Vince McMahon, Shawn Michaels, Ernest Miller, Gorilla Monsoon, Kevin Nash, Diamond Dallas Page, Harley Race, Sergeant Slaughter, Dusty Rhodes, Randy Savage, Luthez Six, Mike Wenner, Vader, The Giant, The Patriot, and Mae Young. NHB. Some notes from watching the pay-per-view version of the March 13th UFC show. The Mikey Burnett vs. Eugenio Tadeu match was better live, particularly where I was, because the power in Burnett's punches were amazing live and the fact Tadeu was staying in there from those punches came off as incredible. Kimo vs. Tsuyoshi Kosaka was about the same live as on tape, while Jerry Bullender vs. Kevin Jackson, because it was more of a technical match, was even better on television, even though it was a great match live. There was booing at times from the crowd, in particular when Pat Militic got the decision from Townsend Saunders. Where I was sitting, the feeling among the fans was that Saunders should have won the match, but I didn't hear much booing for the decision, but on tape you can hear a lot of booing. In the Jackson-Bullender match, while there is a spot where Jackson appears to tap once when caught in the armbar, I don't think it was really a tap. However, there is no question John McCarthy made the right call in stopping the match because Jackson's arm was in a bad position and the last kind of publicity UFC needed was that one of America's top wrestlers was going to be out of action for a year after suffering a broken arm in a UFC match. Dan Henderson won a gold medal at 187 pounds and UFC champion Randy Couture placed third this past week in a world-class level Greco-Roman tournament in Milan, Italy. There was a major submissions-only tournament in Abu Dhabi from March 20th to March 22nd which featured several names from NHB and Shoot and Semi-Shoot Pro Wrestling. In the Absolute Division, Mario Sperry, EFC, where he lost a great match to Igor Zinoviev, Mars, was declared the winner when his opponent scheduled for the finals, Ricardo Moraes, who has done 3 shoot matches for rings with a 1-1-1 record and beat Ilyakine Mikhail to win the second Russian Absolute tournament a few years ago, was injured in his semifinal win over Joe Charles and couldn't come out for the championship match. Charles, an NHB veteran around the world best known for losing suspicious matches to Vitor Belfort and Oleg Toktarov in Japan, placed 4th in the 8-man tournament. Sperry won his first-round match over former UFC star Toktarov on points. In the heavyweight division, over 217 pounds, Rico Rodriguez of the United States beat Sean Alvarez on points. Alvarez has won 2 shoot matches in Japan for rings, over Mikhail and Willie Peters, and lost a Vale Tudo match in Brazil to Toktarov via a lightning-fast knockout. Jason Farron, who lost a UFC match in 1994 to Guy Mesger, lost via points in his first round match, while Charles and Moraes both won their first round matches via submission, but were eliminated via a decision and by points, Moraes losing to Rodriguez in the second round of the 16-man tournament. In the 216-pound weight class, Sperry beat Ricardo Alves via points to win. Former UFC and Pancrase competitor Joel Sutton lost to former Kingdom competitor Larry Parker in 112 with an armbar in the first round. Parker was eliminated by a Sperry armbar in the second round. Toktarov got a first-round bye, before losing via points to Bo Hirschberger of the United States, who wound up taking third. In the 191-pound weight class, Rodrigo Gracie won a decision over Russian wrestler Karim Barklaev to win the 16-man tournament championship. Carlos Newton, EFC, Shudo, and WF, won his first-round match with a choke before losing on points to Gracie in the second round. In the 167 weight class, Renzo Gracie, WCC, KRS, won the tournament beating Luis Brito in 15:43 with a choke. Brito actually lost a second-round match via points to Matt Hume, EFC, Pancrase, IWF, but advanced when Hume dropped out of the tournament due to an injury. Hume and John Lewis each won first-round matches. Lewis won his first-round match with a choke in 103 and his second-round match with an armbar in 38 seconds before losing to Brito in the semifinals via points and losing the third-place match to Fabiano Aya via points. In what actually was the biggest news out of the tournament, Robin Gracie of Spain lost in the finals at 143 pounds to a Brazilian fighter known only as Soca in 21:45 with a choke. Michael Buell, the lightweight champion of the Amarillo-based USWF, who has a title defense on the March 28 Steve Nelson show, lost via points in his first-round match against a fighter known only as Mark. ECW. There were 2 more sellouts over the weekend, making it 15 consecutive full houses. The only show in recent weeks that wasn't a sellout was March 14th in Poughkeepsie, which drew about 1,600 in a 3,000-seat arena, but the building was only set up for 1,600 and every seat was full. March 21st at ECW Arena drew the usual 1,600 or so. It opened with the FBI vs. Danny during an Amish roadkill. A few minutes in, Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney showed up to make it a 3-way dance, which ended after During and Roadkill were eliminated, and Mahoney pinned Tracy Smothers when Tommy Rich's interference backfired. Doug Furness pinned Bobby Duncombe Jr. Duncombe is in as a regular until May when he goes back to Japan. He was brought in by Lance Wright to get revenge on Furness, but after losing, Wright started yelling at him and had Darren Drostoff, During and Roadkill, attack him. Duncombe made his own comeback, ending by hitting all of them with a plancha. Lance Storm and Chris Condito retained the ECW tag titles, beating Jerry Lynn and Chris Chetty. Mahoney and Rotten issued a challenge for Storm and Condito for the belts, but were attacked and laid out by Shane Douglas, who only did run-ins because his bad elbow has been acting up, and Bam Bam Bigelow, and both did stretcher jobs. Spike Dudley beat Bubba Ray Dudley with an acid drop through a table. During the match, New Jack, John Cronus and the other Dudleys all got involved, and at one point New Jack clocked Sign Guy Dudley with a guitar shot which drew hardway blood. Al Snow pinned Rob Van Dam when Sabu's interference backfired. Match was said to have been real bad. There is a lot of disappointment in Snow from the perspective that he has this amazing ring entrance and is considered a good worker, but his matches generally die because he doesn't do anything spectacular to match up to his ring entrances. Mikey Whipwreck and Tommy Dreamer beat Justin Credible and Jason. It wound up with Dreamer, Whipwreck, Beulah and ref Jim Molyneux all doing stone cold stunners on heels, including heel ref Jeff Jones, but the heels came back and laid all the faces out. A note from last week's issue where it stated at the Queen's show that Dreamer, Whipwreck and Beulah gave Jason, Justin and Chastity stunners. Actually it was Whipwreck who gave the stunners to all 3. Sabu beat Too Cold Scorpio. This was said to have been okay, but nowhere close to the matches they've had in the past. Van Dam kept trying to interfere but screwing up on purpose, but Sabu still won with an Arabian facebuster to the back. Main event saw Bam Bam Bigelow beat Sandman to keep the TV title in a bloodbath. Before the match, Taz came out and said he wasn't going to make an excuse for Bigelow beating him or complain about the ref missing the tap out or the ring breaking, thereby making the excuses while saying he wasn't. Sandman shook Taz's hand for the speech. Bigelow bled heavily from cane shots but ended up winning with the Michinoku driver, which is called Greetings from Asbury Park. March 20th in Blackwood, New Jersey drew a sellout 1,200 with Bigelow over Dreamer and Van Dam over Scorpio as the top matches. Ulf Hermann from Germany came in for a tryout, losing to Doug Furness. He was big, but that was about it and wasn't ready. Paul Heyman saw Reckless Youth wrestle on March 22 in Newark, New Jersey on the Jersey All-Pro Show and either has or will be offering him a spot. Youth has a tryout for WWF shortly, I believe April 13th in Philadelphia. Every time I hear about ECW running in an 800-seat building in Queens and turning people away, it's hard to understand, but every time I see television from that building I understand. The crowd heat makes for great television whether or not the matches or the interviews are good. WCW. There was nothing new at press time regarding the contractual situation with Six, although many in the company were talking as if they expected he would be brought back. There apparently was an agreement reached between Hulk Hogan and Kevin Nash to try and use the real heat, probably including the firing of Six, and try and work a wrestling angle out of it which would enable Nash to headline against Hogan, which pacifies him somewhat. This only solidifies Hogan as the center of the universe, since Savage, Piper, Hart, Sting and Nash all have issues with him, but none have issues with anyone else that are going to be pushed to any level. Not only that, but there have also been rumors flying around regarding Jim Hellwig, including a mention of a rumor by Mark Madden on the WCW hotline. 95% of the time any rumors about Hellwig are false, and logic never seems to get in the way of them spreading, such as the widespread rumor that Hellwig was going to debut with Titan last week based on the fact they were doing tapings in Phoenix, not realizing that they have an outstanding lawsuit that is far from being settled. This was actually a situation where a guy at the gym told Nash, both live in the Phoenix area, that he talked with Hellwig, or someone who talks with Hellwig, and Hellwig said he was going to WCW. But between all those sources, the story could lose something in the translation. Anyway, what we've been able to find out is at least at press time there is no deal, but there definitely is smoke to this fire, possibly interest in him working 2 pay-per-view shows in late 1998. I'm not sure the timing is right. There is no question that as bad as Hellwig is, he would mean a short-term bump in TV ratings due to curiosity, although Roddy Piper didn't mean that, and he should have for the same reason this week, and for attendance the first time he appears in every city. Of course his track record says he won't last, but that's actually okay from a business standpoint because by the time he walks, most of the value will have been gotten. The problem is that the Hellwig bump should be used either when WCW has no fresh foes for Hogan on pay-per-view, which is hardly the case, or when ratings are slipping, to jumpstart them. Bischoff is scheduled to go to Japan for the Inoki retirement show and try and put back together the New Japan deal. The sellout streak ended at 20 when the March 22 show at the Crown in Cincinnati put 13,060 in a building that holds 17,342, which was 10,060 paying $177,803. The new streak started on March 23 in Louisville at Freedom Hall for Nitro with 15,143 paying $260,730, which is by far the all-time record gate for that city, although there have been larger crowds in the past. It was one of the best Nitros ever, although it fell victim to the time lag theory in ratings in that it takes time to get people interested in hot new acts such as Chris Jericho's new character, Eddie Guerrero's byplay with nephew Chavo Jr., and Bill Goldberg. Show opened with a Piper interview, and he had a lot of points to get across and did a good job with them, even the ones that made no logical sense. Such as saying that no baseball bats would be allowed until the pay-per-view. Does that mean up to this point they were allowed? Everyone booed that, which again shows where the audience today is coming from. He set up himself and Giant vs. Hogan and Nash as the main event for the April 19th pay-per-view in Denver. He said it would be a first-time ever bad match. I mean a bat match, because it would hardly be a first-time ever bad match. They'll hang a bat from the ceiling and whoever gets it can use it. Piper then plugged Giant vs. Nash and him vs. Savage as the TV main events. Ultimo Dragon beat Chavo Jr. in 2:09 in a hot short match. After the match, Eddie berated Chavo, and Eddie did a great job on his interview, particularly when telling Chavo to apologize to his grandmother for being a disgrace to the family. Bischoff and Hogan came out, so Hogan added himself to the Giant match, making it a handicap bout. Scott Steiner beat Wayne Bloom with the camel clutch in 3:04. Psicosis pinned Lodi with the Norte California Jam in 2:55. Lodi broke his ankle legit during the match, catching Psicosis as he did a twisting corkscrew moonsault off the top rope to the floor. It was too short but very good work. Sting retained the WCW title, beating Diamond Dallas Page in 10:59 with the Scorpion Death Drop after blocking the Diamond Cutter. Hogan came up with the finish. Best match of the show and probably Sting's best singles match in years. Lex Luger racked Rick Fuller in 3:15. They said Fuller was 6'8", 400 pounds, which is an exaggeration, although Fuller is one huge agile guy with a good look. Somebody could do something with him. Eddie Guerrero beat Kaz Hayashi Shiryu, in 5:05 with a frog splash. Nobody knows Hayashi, and unfortunately without his mask he looks like a tiny sophomore in high school, but he can really work, and this was a hot match. Interplay with Chavo Jr. was great again. Prince Aokia pinned Conan in 5:42 with a Northern Lights suplex. Conan did everything, and it was his best performance in a long time, carrying this to an above-average match. Chris Jericho came out, but Lenny Lane came out asking for his $1,000 for the Dean Malenko ruse. Jericho then said that Lane, who he called Larry, had stolen his ring outfit and his juvie mask and his title belt and his lover boy tapes and gone into the ring. Jericho was hilarious. Jericho works a great title match for his gimmick, selling and giving up a lot of near falls before winning at the end, but unfortunately Lane isn't up to the level yet. Giant beat Hogan and Nash via DQ in 6:22 when Ed Leslie interfered. Giant's weight is now up to a legit 493 pounds. You'd think he'd want to lose weight, not be trying to put on 5 pounds a week. And you haven't seen small until you see Brian Hildebrand in the ring next to Giant, Nash, and Hogan. In the ring, Hogan gets worse by the week. It's amazing to see about where it improved 200% when Nash tagged in. Nash's height this week was varying between 6'11" and 7 feet, I guess depending on what he's been eating, or is it what the announcers have been drinking? Leslie went for the Stone Cold Stunner on Giant, who wouldn't go down, basically exposing the move. Giant wound up choke slamming Bischoff. Booker T went to a 7:35 time limit draw with Chris Benoit in a TV title match. Fans booed the finish heavily because everyone knew it didn't go close to 10 minutes. Very good until the finish killed it. Davey Boy Smith beat Kurt Hennig via DQ in 5:38. I think the streak continued with this one. Rick Rude handcuffed Smith to the ropes and they destroyed him until Hart showed up and cleaned house on not only Hennig and Rude, but also Bryan Adams, Vincent, Conan, and Norton. He then did an interview where he said something about someone saying Brett screwed Brett. Finally Doug Dillinger came out with Unlock the Handcuffs with a key. Hey, how did Dillinger have a key to Rude's handcuffs? I smell a conspiracy. How come not one announcer noticed this? Dillinger must secretly be a double agent. I hope they fire his ass. Hey, it worked last year when Sting would beat up 6 guys at a time all year long to build for one Starrcade match, and it appears now the plan is for Hart to wrestle limited times if at all, but do lots of run-ins throughout the year beating up all the NWO huge stiffs and pizza delivery men to build for one huge buy rate. Speaking of Hart, on the deal last week with his parents' house, the City Council of Calgary was deadlocked in its voting and nobody wants to say anything for fear of getting someone mad who was break the deadlock in the wrong direction, so at this point nothing is resolved. Goldberg pinned Renegade in 40 with a jackhammer. Goldberg's left eye was busted open. Finally Piper and Savage was a no contest when half the world interfered in about 3:30. Piper kissed Elizabeth. Hasn't anyone ever told Piper about sexual harassment in the workplace? Liz ended up taking a bump. Hogan came out to beat up the ref. Nash came out with a baseball bat and went to hit Savage, but Hogan stopped him and wanted him to hit Piper, and they shoved each other to tease. Sting showed up with his own bat, but Savage jumped him, allowing Nash and Hogan to beat up Piper until Giant made a run-in and took the bats from Hogan and Savage, and the heels left. Latest Wrestling War is Nashville. WCW is doing a Thunder on May 27th, Wednesday, while WWF is doing Raw on May 18th. WWF put tickets on sale on March 24th, beating the WCW on sale date by a few days. WCW has gotten March 28th in Nashville declared as Jimmy Hart Day, and Hart is going to camp out with the people in line for tickets at midnight on March 27th all night. In the April 27th battle with Raw in Hampton and Nitro in Norfolk, WWF has sold 5,910 tickets for $102,000, or about 80% of the building, while Nitro is already sold out at 9,000 tickets and $164,000. Kevin Green's contract with the Carolina Panthers has no clause in it that prohibits him from doing pro wrestling during the offseason. Green's San Francisco 49er contract specifically prohibited him from pro wrestling. Kevin nails weight calls. The original Latrell Sprewell is expected to join the NWO and get a big push. In 1991, Waycalls, apparently in an argument over getting an $8,000 payoff for working a prelim match at the famous WWF Wembley Stadium SummerSlam show, allegedly began choking Vince McMahon, supposedly because McMahon wouldn't give him more money, until the agents heard the screams and pulled him off. Waycalls then called the police and claimed that McMahon had sexually assaulted him. Even wrestlers who normally would side with a wrestler against an owner thought it was a cheap shot beyond all proportions, even for this business. Waycalls never worked in WWF again, although he did offer some amazing testimony against McMahon in his 1994 trial on steroid charges. Think about this. Pat Patterson, in that same trial, testified under oath that he had never even heard of steroids until the late 80s. This from the same guy who was friends with and held the NWA tag team titles with Billy Graham in 1971 and was turned into a complete buffoon by prosecutors. And even he came out of the trial with more credibility than wake calls. Next thing you know, somebody can OJ his girlfriend and get a job in this profession. Hell, they can do that and afterwards be considered for the Hall of Fame in this profession. Thunder on March 29th in Terre Haute, drew a sellout 6,814. 6,489 paying $129,345. Show drew a 3.8 rating and 5.9 share and the replay did a 1.1 rating and 4.3 share. Jericho beat Super Kalo to keep the cruiser belt in 4:35. Kalo did an awesome dive and they had good near falls. Kendall Windham pinned Dandy in 2:41 with a bulldog. After the match, Tony Schiavone said, "A good big man can beat a good little man any day of the week." That may or may not be true, but what did it have to do with that match? Perry Saturn beat La Parka with the rings in 3:53. A style clash but kind of a wild match. Parka of course got KO'd by his own chair. They aired the MTV angle where Raven hit Page with a stop sign, DDT'd him through a table and walked off with the US belt. Ray Traylor pinned Barry Darsow with a trailer slam in 4:10. Aokia pinned Yuji Nagata with a Northern Lights suplex in 5:20. I'm just wondering who in Power got caught with a marital indiscretion that Prince has photos of. Bryan Adams destroyed Marty Jannetty in 3:31 of a one-sided squash with a tilt-a-whirl slam. Eddie Guerrero pinned Psicosis with a frog splash in 4:11. Psicosis did a twisting moonsault from the top rope to the floor that was insane. He then missed a corkscrew moonsault into the ring. Raven DDT's Brad Armstrong after Hammer and Reese had destroyed him. Lodi had a sign telling Brad he'd better call somebody in reference to what his brother Brian says every week on WWF television. Norton pinned Benoit after a shoulder breaker in 5:18. Norton refused to submit to Benoit's crossface and came back to win. Real good match, easily the best bout Norton has been in with this company. Benoit also got the second biggest pop on the show. Goldberg pinned Bloom in 1:19. Rick Steiner beat Hennig via DQ in 1:27 when, you guessed it, the NWO interfered. Ted DiBiase got a huge pop throwing a punch, but then Rude beat him up. Ted ended up rolling around with Virgil. Ray Traylor ran in but he got destroyed. Finally Goldberg ran in and tackled Adams and Hennig at the same time, and then tackled Norton to a huge pop. Juventud Guerrera has been out the past week because he's all banged up. Nothing serious. At the March 23rd Nitro, they debuted a deal as an experiment on DirecTV. They had one channel on DirecTV for the regular TNT feed, and another that would air Nitro without commercials. I don't understand the logic of this because the whole idea of drawing big ratings for the station is to be able to sell commercial time. On the second feed, they had Lee Marshall host segments while the show was in a commercial break, and they'd show the matches in progress while they broke. At one point during the commercial break, Marshall got into an argument with Bischoff and Bischoff actually took a bump from him, which is weird since he was taking the choke slam later in the show. The working idea is to do this every Monday after a pay-per-view. Weekend House Show saw March 20th in Troy, Ohio draw a sellout $3,526 and $66,135 and March 21st in Hammond, Indiana drew a sellout $3,894 and $58,620 along with Cincinnati. WCW Saturday night tapings on March 17th in Ozark, Alabama drew a sellout $2,317 paying $44,026. Merchandise for the week was $411,038 or $9.92 per paying admission. Scott Putski was backstage at Nitro in Louisville scheduled for a tryout match but it was canceled. The March 20th issue of the Baltimore Jewish Times had a feature on Bill Goldberg. According to this article, Goldberg's father was an obstetrician and gynecologist for years at Johns Hopkins University Hospital and he's 3 classes short of getting his degree in psychology. Not only is Ric Flair not on television, but he's never even mentioned on television. WCW did one of its sleazy hotline deals teasing the retirement of a major superstar, which again when saying it they figured would think Flair, but of course they were just doing the Dean Malenko angle. Some more notes on the movie Man in the Moon on the life of comedian Andy Kaufman that will star Jim Carrey. As mentioned before, the Jerry Lawler angle, which may be played as if it was a shoot rather than a total work, will be part of the movie. It is believed that the wrestler in the movie won't be called Jerry Lawler, since New Line, a Time Warner company, is producing it, although the manager feuding with the wrestler will be played by Jimmy Hart as himself. WCW is trying to get Disco Inferno chosen for the Lawler role, although at this point I don't believe Disco has even been notified of it. The Scripps Howard News Service did a story on Kaufman which ran around the country on March 18 talking about the movie and the Lawler angle with quotes from Lawler. In the article, Lawler tried to act like the angle in Memphis, and a later series of angles, including the most famous of all live on the David Letterman show, was actually a shoot. Actually, the next night after the angle, which got a ton of mainstream attention because stuff like that didn't happen on television in those days, this was 1982, Letterman said that it was all a put on by both men. WCW Saturday Night on March 21 did a 2.5 rating. WWF. Late stipulations added to Mania. Ken Shamrock vs. Rocky Maivia will have the title changing hands on a DQ rules. The dumpster match with Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie vs. Outlaws for the belts will mean that both guys have to be put in the dumpster. And Hunter Hearst Helmsley vs. Owen Hart will have Chyna handcuffed to Sergeant Slaughter. Notes from Raw taping on March 17 in Tucson, Arizona before a sellout 6,893 paying $102,182. Taping started with tryout and shotgun matches as Mark Mero pinned Sean Morley, Goldust pinned Brackus and Taka Michinoku and Aguila and Suicide Kid over Brian Christopher and Tantera and Fallen Angel. Suicide Kid is a 17-year-old from Southern California who is really green but does great flying moves. Fallen Angel is Kevin Quinn, who also wrestles as Christopher Daniels, who is originally from Chicago, now lives in Southern California, and worked for EMLL last year. This was said to have been the best match on the card. Headbangers beat Savio Vega and Jose Estrada Jr., who ended up breaking up, winding up with Vega and Miguel Perez feuding with Estrada and Jesus Castillo. Raw opened with Steve Austin coming out for an interview. Slaughter then told Austin he'd be wrestling Maivia on TV under orders from Vince McMahon, or else his match at Mania would be a non-title match. They made a big deal about Austin having to wrestle this close to Mania, but I guess it was no big deal that Maivia had to. Cactus and Chainsaw beat Quebecers via DQ when Outlaws interfered in 3:48, clocking both with a champagne bucket and broke a table on Funk's head and left them laying. Jeff Jarrett beat Steve Blackman in 2:27 due to interference from Tennessee Lee. Jarrett has a great ring entrance and the heat dies once he starts wrestling. A second ref, Jack Doan, ran in to tell the first ref, but Jarrett attacked Doan. Blackman cleaned house on Jarrett and chased Lee away. Watching Robert Welch run away was not a pretty sight, especially since poor Blackman had to chase him and not catch him. Blackman hasn't mastered the Bruiser Brody sprint. Brody had to learn it by chasing Abdullah the Butcher at full speed but somehow never catching him, which is to run sideways giving the illusion of lots of movement but never getting anywhere. Undertaker did an interview in what was obviously not a cemetery. Way too sappy. Kane did tricks where he set off fireworks at the announcer's table, in the upper deck and in the spotlight stand before setting a stunt man on fire. Seemed too much like leftovers from a bad Papa Shango angle. Fans booed the tricks as if they thought it was insulting to try and put that over as magical powers. Skull and 8-ball DDQ Midnight Express in 3:32 when all the tag teams that could find interfered to set up the tag team battle royal. DX did an interview, including Michaels insulted an obviously planted woman who he called a skank in the audience. Tyson was there, but didn't do anything memorable aside from drive up the ratings. Chains pinned Farouk in 3:38 when Rocky accidentally on purpose hit Farouk with a chair. Rocky was great. Match was terrible. Even though WWF's storylines are as good, and often better than WCW, the gap between the companies when it comes to wrestling talent is incredibly huge. And speaking of bad matches, Bradshaw pinned Barry Windham in 3:04 with a schoolboy. Midnights and Windham beat up Bradshaw after Until Rock and Rolls, wearing WWF t-shirts, made the save. Vince Russo, using that name and not Vic Venom playing a character, gave Sable a plaque for supposedly selling the most magazines of any issue in history. Luna came out and clocked her with the plaque, which broke in several pieces, and then ripped up Sable's dress. Luckily Russo gallantly sloppily tried to cover up Sable's underwear and did such a good job of it that we kept getting shots of it. Finally Austin pinned Maivia in 10:44 with the stunner in a good match. Dark match was Undertaker and Charlie and Cactus beating Kane and Kama Mustafa and D'Lo Brown. Most of the match saw Brown in the ring, and he finally got choke slammed by Undertaker. Dick Togo, Men's Teo, and Shoichi Funaki, the originally DX group from Michinoku Pro, all signed contracts and will debut on the March 30th Raw from Albany. WWF is also close to signing 3 new wrestlers that will apparently be given a big push. I believe that 2 of them will be Steven Regal and John Tenta. Tentative plans are to run an England-only pay-per-view on September 19th in Sheffield, England. Owen Hart didn't work this weekend, so his first match back will be at Mania. Bradshaw was back in the ring at the tapings, while Road Dogg and Shawn Michaels will be back at Mania, but it is expected that Michaels won't be wrestling again until a long time afterwards. Due to a mix-up in regards to the location of the $50 tickets for Mania at the Fleet Center, everyone who bought a $50 ticket was given a voucher for an additional free ticket for a ticket to an upcoming WWF event. Weekend house shows business was huge, with March 20th in Pittsburgh drawing $12,476 and $206,929. March 21st in Chicago at Rosemont Horizon drew a sellout $18,913, $17,273 paying $282,471, and March 22nd in Madison Square Garden drew a near sellout $18,199, $15,297 paying $366,311. Cards were basically the same as have been running for several weeks. Undertaker worked with Kama and everything else was the same, with Austin vs. Helmsley, Cactus vs. Gunn, and Shamrock vs. Maivia. Kane did run-ins during the Undertaker match and they did a spot or two together every night. The only thing we heard was the spots in Pittsburgh flopped as Undertaker tried to use Kane as a base for a move and it didn't work and he fell down. Merchandise for the week was $514,063 or $9.90 per paying customer. Advance for the April 26th pay-per-view in Greensboro is 10,652 tickets and $192,000. Livewire on March 21st did a 1.7 rating and Superstars on March 22nd did a 1.9. The April 4th show in Manchester, England has already sold out without one match being announced. There are rumors about doing the 1999 Royal Rumble in England. The Reader's Pages. Hall of Fame. I found you candidates for prospective inductions into your Wrestling Hall of Fame to be interesting. Some of the prospects are no-brainers. Some of the choices we need to wait a little bit longer in order to see how the story of their careers are completely told. Masakatsu Funaki should definitely be in. He was one of the founding figures of Pancrase. He may not be the best shooter in Pancrase, but he's the most popular and influential. Ken Shamrock should be inducted if you are basing it solely on his UFC credentials. He was also an important figure in the inception of Pancrase in UFC. But the rest of his pro wrestling career is not worthy of being in the Hall of Fame, at least yet. Unless you are only considering Pancrase. He was not the top star in either UWF and PWFG. If you are considering Shamrock, one must recognize Dan Severn. He won many amateur wrestling championships and was also a key figure in UFC. Severn's pro wrestling career is pretty complete compared with Shamrock. Severn isn't really a drawing card and is more of an attraction on independent shows. His wrestling skills and personality are bland and mechanical in a worked environment, but he is an important figure in the NHB industry but has never been a big hit as a pro wrestler. Does a successful career in NHB and a bland wrestling career quality one for the Hall of Fame? Karl Gotch was a major shooter of his day, but his wrestling career in the United States was not that significant. Ultimo Dragon, Jushin Liger, and possibly Chris Benoit should be inducted. They were successful in revolutionizing the junior heavyweight division. They've all achieved major success in Japan and some success in Mexico and the United States. Great Sasuke at this point shouldn't be considered. He's a hot independent wrestler who can hang in with the big boys. But he has not been successful on a consistent basis either as a promoter or as a singles headliner. I can't see Owen Hart at all. Sure, he was an awesome lighter weight wrestler in the late 80s and early 90s, but has not wrestled at that level for many years. He has been a solid and occasionally excellent ring technician. He has never been a major drawing card. All of his hindrances became evident in 1994 in his feud against Bret Hart. Few of their matches were spectacular and the feud was not that big of a hit at the box office. Shinya Hashimoto is a definite. He displays the qualities of a world champion. He works stiff and believable matches. There is always the aura of importance when Hashimoto defended the title. He can usually carry a lesser opponent to a decent and sometimes memorable match. One must also throw in how successful he has been at headlining Tokyo Dome shows. I would consider Sting. He played the same role as Ric Flair. They have always gone back to giving him the top spot when others have failed. Even while Sting was on top, he has always maintained popularity and interest and has maintained a spot in the upper echelon of WCW for 11 years. Jimmy Snuka is a very intriguing pick. He was an awesome wrestler in the late 70s and early 80s. But he was only a major drawing card for a short period of time, especially when you compare him to most of the people already in. Most people still rave about him, so he did leave a lasting impression. In his day, most people thought of Snuka as being a hot worker, but he has sucked for so long, similar to reasons why people like Jake Roberts and Barry Windham shouldn't be considered. By 1986, Snuka was already washed up and living off his name. When Snuka returned to the WWF in 1989 to 1991, he was jobbed out and not really over to any degree. His talent, charisma, and popularity by that time was obviously gone. He still wrestles on the independent scene. At all of the shows I've seen him at, he has maintained some interest by the older fans, but younger fans have no idea who he is. But that doesn't make him a drawing card, not even on a small local level. Snuka usually looks completely spaced out and is incoherent when talking to the fans. This makes me agree with Vince McMahon's comments when he referred to Snuka as a basket case in 1986. Barry Windham shouldn't be inducted. He was never a long-time top-heel draw. He was a hot babyface, but that wasn't for a long time on a national level. I can't see Terry Gordy either. Jake Roberts may very well have good psychology, but he is always self-destructed. Scott Hall shouldn't even be considered. Kevin Nash and Lex Luger can be written off as failures when they got their chance, but to their credit, both are decent supporting players. Larry Zbyszko should definitely be inducted, especially when you consider the 20 glorious years. He's performed in front of kings, queens, and emperors. He's mastered the game of human chess, and one must also acknowledge he is quite an accomplished shooter. At least that's when he claims. And he retired Bruno Sammartino when he beat him at Shea Stadium. He truly is the legend of his own time. Unfortunately, I can't find any record to back up any of this, so I have to go only based on what I hear when watching WCW Nitro. Too bad most of this information comes only from Larry's mouth. Eric Bimbin. Brooklyn, New York. I think the Hall of Fame issues you've published so far are great and agree with you qualifications to be in. I want to make a comment on some of the wrestlers you mentioned in the March 16th issue. Steve Austin, as long as he keeps on the current pace, he absolutely belongs in. He's helped the WWF weather the shaky storm created by the surge of WCW, and anyone who can carry a promotion on their back while being severely injured deserves consideration. Chris Benoit absolutely belongs. The reason he hasn't been a big draw is because he's always been kept down from realizing his potential. Ultimo Dragon absolutely. His 3-minute matches on Nitro don't help at all. Scott Hall no way. All of his really good matches have been because Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart and others carried him. He just hasn't done enough in his career. Grant Hamada should be in without a doubt. Michael Hayes, I just can't picture Doak Hendricks as a Hall of Fame performer. Kurt Hennig at this point, no. Paul Heyman, yes, he's taken ECW to a level that nobody could have expected, whereas Smoky Mountain folded. Cactus Jack, yes, he's done so many unique things in his career and so many sick matches in Japan. He always brings a different flavor to wrestling. Lex Luger, no way. He can't work. He has little charisma. He's never tried to improve himself. When you look back over his career, he really hasn't done as much as you'd think. Kevin Nash, I can't even believe you gave him a thought. Jake Roberts, I'd give a nod because he was always near the top and always doing something interesting, aside from that blindfold match with Rick Martel. Ken Shamrock, yes, for everything he did in Pancrase and UFC. Davey Boy Smith's jump to WCW sealed his fate. He's a permanent mid-card wrestler and doesn't belong. Sting, nope. He's had a million chances but has always fallen short for some reason. He's been a guy who has been very lucky to be given a lot of breaks. Undertaker, yes, because he's been at the top for so long and unlike so many big guys, can have great matches. Sid, no way in hell. Steve Williams has done well but I say no. Larry Zbyszko, see Sid. Matt Griffin. Quantico, Virginia. Sammartino. I recently saw a newspaper clipping in Koji Miyamoto's first book on Lou Thesz. In Thesz' 2 of 3 fall win over Buddy Rogers on February 7, 1963, Thesz won the first fall on a disqualification, so the win wasn't as clean as we had been led to believe. There is a great interview with Bruno Sammartino in Wrestling Perspective. In it he claims that he had to threaten Buddy Rogers with a shoot to get him to drop the title. I respect Sammartino as both a person and as a wrestler, but it seems he reacts to second-hand reports and doesn't read things that he gets upset about. The stuff on Louis Spicoli's death was good. We don't use somas in the hospital I work, so I'm weak on them, but I believe I gave them out a few times in the Army 20 years ago. I thought they were weak, a muscle relaxer with a base of aspirin or Tylenol. I didn't think of them as a dangerous drug, but if you took 48 aspirins you'd throw up like a fool too. I can't see how any company can stop employees from taking legal prescription drugs.
The problem is the alcohol they are drinking with the drugs.
Everybody is responsible for themselves.
If there is any blame, it should rest on Louis.
He was a great guy and a good wrestler who will be missed, but he was a fool like all the others. Steve Yohei. Montebello, California. A few thoughts from a 25-year-long wrestling fan. I began watching wrestling around the time Bruno Sammartino began his second title reign. He became my hero and remains so even until this day. With that in mind, I was very disappointed when I recently read his autobiography. Totally in his wrestling character. It not only made me feel deceived but also limited him in really telling all. I'm sure he can enlighten us on many interesting issues. Although I realize he was protecting the business by telling the story this way, I for one would like to read a Bruno Sammartino, The Truth Story. Bruno should realize that most everyone knows pro wrestling is a work. Anyone who doesn't know it needs to be enlightened. Just as we escape into the fantasy of a movie, we escape into the fantasy of pro wrestling. We can see footage on television of how they do the special effects in the movies,
so we can be informed about the reality of pro wrestling.
Neither knowledge lessens the enjoyment of the product. In both cases, it enhances it. The knowledge that pro wrestling is a work can also keep the naive and the children from trying the stuff. Vince McMahon may be everything he has been accused of being, but let's not deny his greatness as well. He is a creative genius and the pioneer of this sport. Take all the wrestlers in WCW and WWF and reverse the two. Would WCW last with the talent in WWF right now? Would anyone even care about them?
On the other hand, with the WCW talent crew in WWF, Vince would make it the only wrestling organization to watch.
It is Vince McMahon's creative genius combined with Eric Bischoff's lack of such that keeps the WWF alive and well. When McMahon is gone from wrestling, he will be sorely missed, if not for the man himself, surely for the drama and storylines that only he can deliver. Give him the credit he deserves for a change. He's earned it. John Rod. Massapequa Park, New York. Spicoli.
I attended Louis Spicoli's funeral.
Some of Louis' first matches were for me in Arizona.
Out west, the talent isn't lucky enough to be seen as much as the talent in the east or the south.
So when Louis was getting booked for WWF, ECW and WCW, it was great to finally have a worker from out west getting a shot. I wish he could have controlled his problem. I never knew he had one. His passing, as you know, will not be the last one. Maybe some of the so-called superstars in their own minds will wake up, and they know who they are. Steve Gator Wolfcatcher. St. George, Utah. Gilbert. I attended the 3rd annual Eddie Gilbert Memorial Brawl. It was a fitting tribute to a great man. Dennis Coralluzzo and his staff deserve a great deal of praise for this event. The highlight without a doubt was Eddie Gilbert's mother telling the crowd that Paul Heyman is the kind of person who would stab you in the back while patting you on the back. This is from a woman who has never said a word at any other tribute show.
Doug Gilbert has to also be given credit for not attacking the person who was a brainwashed ECW head who believed every word Heyman has to say.
I agree that he has the right to his opinion, even if he was wrong, but this was not the time or the place. Last, I must say how disappointed was that Tammy Fitch no-showed again.
The thing that bugs me about this is that Dennis gave her and Chris Candido their break in the business, and this is the way they repay him.
Ron Degno. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Response from Dave Meltzer. As far as the Gilbert show is concerned, Coralluzzo canceled Tammy Fitch's booking, not the other way around, stemming from the heat from the previous week.
I'm not sure a memorial for Eddie Gilbert was the classy venue to use to bury Paul Heyman.
Coralluzzo did offer an apology to the point of saying that he agreed it wasn't the time or place to say what he said but that he believes every word of it.
But the truth is a lot more complicated than Heyman backstabbing Gilbert and stealing the company from him.
To simplify anything to that level is to create fiction. Dennis Coralluzzo did an outstanding job in presenting the Eddie Gilbert tribute weekend.
Jim Cornette was highly entertaining and friendly to all who attended.
Nick Bockwinkel appeared to be as interested in talking with the fans as they were to him. Bockwinkel held nothing back during the question and answer session. Eddie's family is fortunate to have a dedicated and sincere friend and promoter to keep this tradition alive.
The event truly has become an annual wrestling highlight that a great many people appreciate.
Donnie Label. In New York. WCW Saturday Night. In response to Satch Williams' letter in the February 16th issue, I liked watching WCW Saturday Night on mute. It was always funny seeing how those closed caption guys tried to type what Dusty was saying. Scott Wallace. Billerica, Massachusetts. Toyota. It was nice to read your praise of Momoe Nakanishi. I saw her 3 times live in October and was very impressed. She looked even better on television. Your comments about Manami Toyota, however, were shocking. The last TV show of 1997 you were praising her to death for her matches against Asia Kong and Yumiko Hata. She invented some new moves not more than 2 years ago along with countless others throughout her career. She has teamed with and wrestling against Emi Motokawa quite often in semi-comedic matches which have been a refreshing change of pace for her, and she appears to enjoy herself in the ring. She has even changed her wrestling attire. She can't jump to the top anymore? The comment is laughable because she has done it so many times recently. After viewing the match, it is my opinion that she landed on the rope with her knees to control the plancha rather than propel herself onto the announcer's table. In the right circumstances, she would still give better entertainment than 95% of the bump passing as wrestlers in North America. Passe? Never. She has so much to offer. John Castles. Stockport, England. In the March 9th Observer, you mentioned that one of the things which makes the top wrestlers like Mitsuharu Misawa, Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, Ric Flair and others the best is that they stick to moves that they can perform effectively. Fair enough. A few pages later you expressed disappointment with Manami Toyota because she no longer comes up with new maneuvers. It seems you are holding her to a higher standard than you hold the male wrestlers. I know you regard her as one of the best. It just seems strange to see 2 statements in the same issue which seem so contradictory. I just wish more wrestlers had a repertoire as passe as Toyota's. It never ceases to amaze and depress me to watch the audience at Nitro. There can be 6 bodies flying through the air during a Lucha Libre Trios match and half the people are talking to each other, holding up their signs or checking out other members of the crowd. But as soon as Hulk Hogan is in the ring and delivering an eye poke, everyone is going crazy. Bill Mills. Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Response from Dave Meltzer. It's no different than a lot of other sports. Watch any major boxing pay-per-view event and you'll see the arena empty during the preliminaries and those there not paying any attention, even when a great fight is going on in front of their eyes. But when the main event is in the ring and they are seeing the personalities they've been hyped to pay attention to, you can often cut the tension with a knife even if it's a poor fight. You have to remember that the announcers and the way they've been booked has already taught the fans that those wrestlers aren't important, so no matter what they do, why should the fans pay attention to something that even the announcers calling the action don't care about? DiBiase. In Just Read Burt Duckwall's letter in the February 16th issue regarding Ted DiBiase's book, Every Man Has His Price, Mr. Duckwall is entitled to his opinion, however I disagree with his perspective. In my opinion, DiBiase's uplifting Christian messages combined with stories about his youth and wrestling history made this book worth my time and money. Apparently Duckwall didn't like the fact DiBiase only hinted at his alcoholism and cheating on his wife. If you're looking for a book geared toward exploitive details on the sleazy lifestyles of wrestlers, this book doesn't serve that purpose. DiBiase's main focus of his book is to reveal how the good times and bad times in his personal and professional life have taught him godly lessons and have led him closer to Christ, with scriptures that relate to our lives. Being both a Christian and a wrestling fan, I believe this is the kind of positive book that would reach out to non-Christians who normally wouldn't seek ministers or Christian media, much in the same way that Mike Tyson could lead non-wrestling fans into watching wrestling. The back cover of this book even has a quote from a minister who says DiBiase's story will impact thousands, whether wrestling fans or not. Duckwall also said the book was very simply written. Well, as my pastor once said, Jesus revealed his word is parables, very simple stories that people of all ages, levels, and backgrounds could understand. John Watanabe. West Chicago, Illinois. Response from Dave Meltzer. Imagine that, Ted DiBiase being compared with Mike Tyson. Robbie Ellis. An interesting sidelight, since you mentioned my concern about it being discovered I was moonlighting as a pro wrestler. All those many years of fearing it being exposed turned out to be unfounded. In the mid-80s, when the story was in Sports Illustrated, ABC, CBS, and PBS, our art business was always treated seriously and positively. The wrestling was treated humorously but also respectfully. The result of the exposure was that our business doubled and then doubled again, and it grew from a local art gallery to a source for high-quality 16th through 20th century paintings nationally and also in Europe. It may seem like a small thing, but the story was in the Boston Globe and not the Portland Globe. Thanks again. At the risk of getting chided for complimenting you, I continue to be impressed with the Observer, particularly for your personal insights which I only wish the world outside of pro wrestling, as well as my friends, could know about. It has been amazing to be some small part of a world and be able to read about it from someone who understands it from all directions.
Rob Alowich aka Robbie Ellis.
Portland, Maine. This is the end of this program.
Thanks for watching.
See you next time.